This is section 10, lecture 4, and in this lecture we're still talking about interest group influence in U.S. foreign policy, and we're going to be talking about some of the theoretical influences of non-governmental organizations, how they act, and how they're influential. When we look at foreign policy non-governmental organizations, those that are most effective tend to be a single issue organizations. They focus on environmental issues or poverty. They focus on human rights. They focus on a specific region or country, a religious or ethnic group that is represented. And that specificity leads to a stronger message oftentimes, a limited message, and the ability then to influence policymakers by not watering down their own message or contradicting themselves. These groups are called particularistic groups, the single issue groups. But that doesn't mean that there aren't larger interest groups in U.S. foreign policy influence. Cosmopolitan groups are general, and they address any number of foreign policy issue areas. And the best known example of a cosmopolitan group would be the Council on Foreign Relations. They address any number of issues and attempt to influence policymakers with policy papers, studies, so on and so forth. Why are non-governmental organizations influential? What do they do? Well, non-governmental organizations provide monitoring of specific issues or specific countries, and they provide that information from the monitoring to our government officials. Oftentimes, they can go where governments cannot go. They can be on the ground throughout the world when official representatives of the U.S. government cannot be for political reasons. Another source of information that NGOs tend to provide to our policymakers is scientific advice, particularly if we're talking about environmental policy. Our congressmen and senators aren't typically environmental scientists, and so they will lean on that type of scientific advice from these groups. But there is a problem with non-governmental organizations, and we'll be sort of addressing these issues throughout. Oftentimes, non-governmental organizations have limited resources and are outside of governments with little or no contact, and so formal interest groups sometimes have a great deal of money and a great deal of membership and have active lobbying movement, but not all NGOs fall into that category. NGOs are groups that are more active throughout the world and probably located throughout the world. And so having a more direct level of influence here in the United States may be difficult depending on their resources. One criticism is that the message, the differing views, is going to lead to a level of influence or importance among non-governmental organizations. Some are going to be listened to because of their message, some are not. And oftentimes, non-governmental organizations are criticized for having a democratic deficit. That is, they don't necessarily represent democratic decision-making within their own organization. They are more forceful and less forgiving when it comes to representing specific ideologies. Why are these groups in existence? Well, oftentimes specific societal needs are not being addressed by governments. And the reason that NGOs rise to address elements of foreign policy or any type of policy is because people aren't paying attention or enough attention to solve a global problem. They oftentimes attempt to represent citizens of all countries, not necessarily citizens here in the United States, and that may lead to less of influence to our congressmen or our senators. Oftentimes, right, and this goes along with our earlier lecture, NGOs are going to be more influential in democratic and capitalist system that allows them to have the freedom of assembly. This also allows multinational corporations to be more political. As I said earlier, where they are really influential is where they can raise attention to specific issues. So they pay attention to the goings-on in the world. They monitor and report problems back to governments. They attempt to lobby governments to change these problems or at least address them. Oftentimes, non-government organizations will call attention to issues by using the media and attempt to shame politicians into acting. And this has become more and more influential if we talk about not just non-governmental organizations, but all types of interest groups. They become more and more influential as social media has become more diverse. And so using the media is one thing, but we see now that we're in an age where social media is very influential. You can get your message out to a larger number of people, and perhaps then they can be influential in those social movements by using social media as an outlet. NGOs are weak sometimes, as I said earlier, because of their budgets, because of the lack of formal contacts with government, because of the division and the split between NGOs, because they are competing with one another on access to government, maybe on differing sides of an issue. But they also have their strengths. They have that direct link to citizens. Members of non-governmental organizations and interest groups are individual citizens. They make up these groups. They're the ones, if they are concerned about a particular issue, that are going to continue to pay attention, continue to try to get the message out. And so then their access to citizens, their communication with them is a source of their strength. They're strengthened by shared values. The reason that someone joins an interest group or a non-governmental organization is because they care about an issue area, and that's going to enhance or strengthen their ability to work. If you get enough membership to care about a specific issue, then perhaps politicians are going to pay attention. And oftentimes they are seen as then enhancing political participation. Those people who may not be interested in the minutiae of domestic politics or any number of policies, because they become interested in a specific foreign policy, will then be pulled into the political arena and be engaged in political participation because of that specific issue area brought in then by the non-governmental organization. What do these organizations do? Well, it depends on the type of non-governmental organizations. It depends on the resources or money that they have. But all of them try to change foreign policy or influence foreign policy. And so the tactics they use are lobbying. The tactics that they use are using the media, as I said earlier, to call attention to specific issue areas, to try to shame politicians into acting. All of these things may be more or less influential in changing our foreign policy. NGOs increasingly over time have become more formalized and professional as well. And many NGOs that began as sort of diverse movements across the world now have set up lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. And engage in that more active and formal lobbying, helping to draft legislation, serving as a source of information to committees and individual members of government, and helping to implement those programs once they are approved back in the world. And this is an interesting thing about non-governmental organizations. Because they're working throughout the world, they are able to see our government resources at work, report back to not just the media, but back to our politicians, and determine whether it's working, whether it's not working, what needs to be changed, so on and so forth. And so they help to implement our government programs, and oftentimes our governments will work through those NGOs specifically because they have so much access and knowledge about the specific issue areas. One type of NGO that tends to be more or less influential in foreign policies are what are referred to as think tanks. Think tanks are groups of oftentimes highly educated individuals or policy-motivated individuals that serve as idea brokers in an attempt to influence public opinion and influence government policy through their policy papers, through their studies and research, through sharing this not just to government, but through the media. Oftentimes, if you watch the news, if you watch the Sunday shows, some people that are represented there work for some of these think tanks. The Council on Foreign Relations is one that I mentioned earlier. It has a broad set of policies that it studies and attempts to influence government on. RAND Corporation has been a research organization that has worked with the U.S. government for a very long time. A more recent one, perhaps, is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that works on international issues when it comes to disease, particularly. Corporations may have their own think tanks. The military-industrial complex is known for having think tanks as well. Oftentimes, the RAND Corporation was used by the Pentagon. Foreign governments and lobbyists serve to try to influence our government as well. And all of these attempt to do so through lobbying. Having that direct contact with members of the Congress, members of the Senate, the President, airing their views through the media, offering campaign contributions, offering contracts, so on and so forth. And so then, NGOs are most effective when it comes to that more organized influence and lobbying of our government. And I mentioned this term before, political action committee. A political action committee is where a politician or a group sets up a fundraising effort, a PAC, in order to fund particular campaigns. They will support specific senators or congressmen who favor their ideas, favor their policies, and attempt to push them through the government. Figure 9.3 from your textbook shows a list here, any number of organizations. You can read this for yourself, but you can see then that these organizations are large in number and in their political diversity as well. So the key question of all of this is seen here. How are they influential? Are they influential? Oftentimes, interest groups have a greater impact on domestic politics than they do foreign policy. If you remember back to our lectures on the Alman-Lippmann consensus, where because people are detached from foreign policy ideas because they don't necessarily pay attention, then oftentimes policymakers overlook public opinion. Well, people are more concerned about their daily lives, and domestic politics is going to touch more on their daily lives than foreign policy does. And so interest groups are more influential in domestic politics than they are in foreign policy. This also goes back to that statement that we discussed earlier in the congressional chapter, that perhaps sometimes foreign policy stops at the water's edge. That is, the representation of U.S. government policy really is a function of the executive branch and not necessarily a function of much of anything else. Studies have shown that these interest groups are not influential during crisis situations. And the greatest influence that they have is not on security issues, but economic issues. And that's where multinational corporations or agricultural sector or the labor unions may come into play. Studies have shown that their impact varies with the specific issue. The less important to politics, the more influential the group is going to be. But if a group is trying to touch on security policy, if they're trying to touch upon a major piece of legislation like a trade agreement, then perhaps their influence will be less. When we discussed how they gain access, we said it's because we have a great diversity in the structure of our government. And so here studies have shown that interest groups are most influential through Congress. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives and 100 senators that an interest group can attempt to lobby. And so then you have that greater access based on the structure of our government. Oftentimes interest groups are more influential during election years. They are more active during election years as well. They give more political campaign contributions, of course, during election years. They have a greater influence when only a narrow segment of the population will be affected. And so then, if it's a very specific and low political issue area, then the interest group may have greater access because it doesn't touch on a lot of people. It's not going to negatively impact a lot of people. And so maybe a specific interest will be more influential then. As I said earlier, most of these groups are single issue groups and they tend to have more influence. And oftentimes interest groups are more influential on public opinion than they are necessarily on true policy change. But that's one way that they are aided in getting what they want done. If you're an interest group, you can use the media, use social media as well, to drum up support, to point out problems, to criticize government policy. And if you get enough support from the masses, then policies may be able to change.